Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Martinez, for the introduction. It's a great honor to be able to precede the new launch for the new brand of Coaltech, and I'd like to do it by discussing a topic that is very close to my heart. I've spent 25 years now in land rehabilitation. I'm an agriculturalist by training, and I've always tried to find the applications of agriculture in rehabilitated mined land. And today I'd like to just talk about future coexistence of mining and agriculture. These are two very important sectors in our country, and they've got a lot to offer each other. The mining environment offers the entire country a lot, but at the same time agriculture as well. And the two together can make a huge difference when it comes to sort of rehabilitating land and using it. And the question is, do we use it for agriculture? And that is what I'd like to discuss today, is maybe just thinking a little bit out of the box. I want to challenge our normal way of thinking of how we should consider rehabilitated mined land. So this is a typical picture that if you fly over areas of mining, something that we see quite a lot. We will see an operational mine, and we'll see a lot of agricultural events around it. And the question is, how can these two different environments function in the same space? Agriculturalists are very concerned always when they see mines buying up a lot of land, and the agricultural sector is worried about where is this land going. We are losing land for agriculture, but there are a lot of opportunities that I think that we are overlooking when it comes to what comes back after rehabilitated mine land. Now, when we look at rehabilitated surface coal mine land, it's always, when you're actually walking on the land, there's always some challenges that we will always see sticking out and concerning people that are agriculturalists. And we have to realize that there are going to be some of these challenges that are going to exist on the mines. And the idea is that we need to find alternative ways of doing our rehabilitation. We have to obviously think about how we're doing it. It's a very precise operation, as much as we feel that it costs a lot of money to do it. But at the end of the day, if you do and apply the basic principles correctly, you can achieve quite a lot. I've assessed a couple of rehabilitated lands over the years, and I've seen some phenomenal potential of these lands. Comparing it to some agricultural lands, there's really a lot to be seen and great production potential. But the question is whether it's going to be the same for all the kinds of agricultural production activities that we normally see prior to mining. So when we look at rehabilitated surface coal mine land, we need to start asking ourselves the question, what is the potential? Is this something that we're going to return back to agriculture? And if we do, can we tell agricultural sector what's the potential? And I think this is where we now need to start thinking how we can do this, because the agricultural sector wants to know, because they have to plan food security and think about food security for the country. So we have to rightfully try and show them what the potential is. Now, when we look at local land use drivers, there's very site-specific land use considerations when it comes to rehabilitation or the use of rehabilitated land. Now, there's water conservation, land productivity, which is important for agriculture, no net loss to ecosystem services, should it be a natural environment that has been mined, energy creation and conservation, and a topic which I think is something that we need to speak a little bit more about. Community enhancement, when community is going to move back into this environment, what is on offer for them? Continual contribution to macroeconomy, and I think this is what we want at the end of the day, is that rehabilitated land must have some value. And then obviously the financial viability of all the rehabilitation practices that we implement. So if we think about agriculture, what is agriculture? It's a culture. It's a culture where I always like to tell my students, it's something where you live with the land. It's the science of practicing farming. And what is farming? Farming is understanding how plants react to soil, how soil determines how plants react. And then how do plants determine how animals react? And then how animals and plants determine how humans react. And this is the whole process of agriculture. Now, when we come with rehabilitation, we're trying to create a foundation for agriculture. And it doesn't mean that agriculture is always going to be the most acceptable land use when it comes to rehabilitated land. So we always got a land cover and we've got a growth medium, and this is how we determine what the land capability is. And these different land capabilities we try and use once we rehabilitate land to try and establish them again to be able to support a particular land use. And sometimes when we come to looking at rehabilitated land, we have not managed it enough to understand what its potential is. We do the rehabilitation according to specifications, and then we leave the land. And then we don't necessarily manage it unless portions of the land is leased back to farmers and they have noticed what the potential is. And these are things that we need to document. So there's obviously land management strategies to use this land, but at the end of the day, the sustainable use of this land is going to be dependent on land stewardship. And that is actually taking ownership of the land. But we ourselves that are responsible for rehabilitating land need to understand as stewards what is the potential we're offering back. Now, I don't want to go into all this detail, but I think what's really interesting is to look at the ecological, societal, and economic factors in relation to mine land rehabilitation. And I like to pitch it against Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. Now, if we look at foundation knowledge, we look at the stability and sustainability and resilience, and this is everything we try and achieve in any operation that we are trying to rehabilitate. And it's really difficult to be able to establish where certain portions of our land that has been rehabilitated fits within this hierarchy. So if you just look at foundational knowledge, we do a lot of research, we try to understand these lands and these environments, and then obviously when we start developing technologies and certain accepted best practices, we try and implement them, and we need to try and create some kind of stability. But the only time that we're going to reach sustainability is when we are actually becoming stewards of that stable landscape that we've rehabilitated, and that we are actually understanding it and managing it. And then eventually, once we are discovering the potential and also the stability of the system, through sustainable practices, we'll be able to achieve resilience. So a project we started many years ago, which is a project funded by Minerals Council. It existed as a result of an MOU between Minerals Council and Agri-SA, was trying to establish what is actually the land use potential of rehabilitated land in the country. And we developed an online information platform where different mining houses could upload their data in a confidential way so that we could aggregate it, so that we can portray it in an online fashion, so that we can get an understanding of what contribution rehabilitated land from the mining sector is actually making, so that we can eventually get to land optimization. And that is something obviously that we obviously need to consider. Now, I always say when you look at a portion of land that a mine owns, the mine does not necessarily mine all of the land that they own. So there is a portion of the land that still has an inherent natural agricultural potential. Whether it is leased back to farmers and used, that can be valuable, but it's not always documented in the agricultural sector. But if there is land that is owned by the mine and is not being used by a farmer, that is not being mined, this sometimes becomes unknown and becomes something that I think could have add huge value to a mining company, knowing that this land has got that potential. Obviously, we're restricted with Mine Health and Safety Act to be able to utilize this land in an agricultural way, because it falls within the mining boundary. But at the same time, we need to understand that the potential of that land is completely different to the rehabilitated land, which we'll eventually achieve once we move towards mine closure. So I want you to keep that in mind, and this is just challenging the normal thoughts, is that even though the land is owned by the mine, is it not an opportunity that within the Mine Health and Safety Act and the OSHA's Act, which the mines have to be compliant to, is there not an opportunity of managing that land and also showing that it's not only land that's been extracted, or not extracted, excluded from the agricultural sector's planning or an understanding of what land is available for food security, but also introducing it back into that, and at the same time, when we rehabilitate land, show what that potential is. All right, so there's many research questions that come from this kind of research, and I don't want to go into all the detail, but we think about soil and we think about the environment and the foundation in which we want to grow vegetation, because we use vegetation for many different purposes. We use it for stabilizing that soil environment, or even a substrate, which is not necessarily soil. We use it for agriculture, and eventually at the end of the day, when we rehabilitate, by default, we're going back to agricultural land capability classes. But to be able to do that correctly, we need to understand the chemical, the physical, and the biological nature of the soil that we reintroduce back into the rehabilitated system, because that is going to dictate how the plants are going to grow, how they're going to respond to that environment. And this is what's really important for us, is that we create an environment that is healthy, that it will support vegetation, so that at the end of the day, when we want to utilize this land for whatever particular purpose, might not necessarily be just for agriculture, that is going to provide you with some kind of potential. So when we look at soils nowadays, and we think about climate change, and we listen to all the debates around that, I can tell you one thing, that the best place to store carbon is in the soil. So there's a lot of work going into the carbon sequestration. And when we look at carbon and we look at the agro-ecosystem resilience, carbon plays a huge role. Even agriculturalists, farmers, are realizing that the conventional and traditional ways of doing agriculture has to change. And the only way they can change it is by looking at regenerative practices. These practices are not as reactive as the conventional and traditional ways, but if you do it properly, it will become a lot more sustainable. And then you'll find yourself sitting in a conservation agricultural situation where you're sitting with a system that is resilient to droughts. Now, one thing that I've noticed on rehabilitated land is that we do very often, one of the biggest challenges on rehabilitated land is compaction. And I always say that I'm fear that we're going to have to rehabilitate rehabilitated land in the future because of the compaction levels. And compaction, to be able to mitigate and alleviate compaction, there's one specific component that will do the job, and that is soil organic carbon or matter. Matter, then carbon. And that is why carbon plays such a huge role. Plant roots are contributors to soil organic carbon. And if we manage vegetation, roots will definitely fix the soils for us if we provide them with that opportunity. So soil organic carbon plays a huge role in the system, and I don't want to go into all the aspects of what it actually does, but it chemically, biologically, and physically buffers the situation or the environment. And it just makes it so much more viable for vegetation to be able to grow. I really like this diagram from Lowell, and it explains it really well, that we talk about water use, we don't talk about it enough, water use efficiency, nutrient use efficiency, and we think about just how much fertilizers are used. We talk about the artificial droughts that we create in these particular environments, and how do we utilize nutrients better? You use nutrients better if you utilize water better. How do we use water better? Is if you create an environment that is rich in soil organic matter, and that will definitely support all these activities. And that will just then make the whole system a lot more stable for agricultural activities. So looking at soil and water conservation, carbon plays a huge role. But carbon is not as easily measured as we think it is. People underestimate what actually happens with the carbon cycle within the soil. And I'll touch on that a little bit just now. But soil organic carbon plays a huge role in water conservation. It plays a huge role in water use efficiency and nutrient use efficiency. And there's a whole list of things that soil organic carbon can do to be able to support the ecosystem services we would so likely try and create or establish within these systems. Now, when we look at the carbon accounting value of forages and grasses, because these are by default planted in rehabilitation practices, carbon in the soil, there's many different fractions of carbon, and they're all at a specific time of decomposition. And if you don't balance those correctly, You cannot just add one aspect or one particular carbon product to the soil and think, oh, well, I've stored carbon, I'm making a huge impact to the soil environment. So it's a balanced approach. And this is what we need to understand a lot better when it comes to using soil as a carbon bank. And if you can do that, there's obviously a lot of benefits that people are trying to quantify when it comes to carbon value, the carbon value in soil, and thinking how it can be linked to carbon credits and things like that. And I'm not going to go into all those different debates. That's a debate for another time. So how do we actually build carbon in the soil? I always like to use the rule of thumb that whatever you see growing above soil, the volume, the mass, the rule of thumb is that there's 2 to 3 times the same amount of biomass below ground. So if you've got 20 tons of dry matter on the soil surface, you can expect 40 to 60 tons below the soil. So roots are playing a huge role. That is if the environment is conducive for root development. And that is why it's so important that we try and mitigate and alleviate physical restrictions within the soil at the same time as the chemical ones. The biology we'll talk about and what it does and makes a difference. So biomass. Biomass, everything that we grow above surface, if we manage that correctly, there's many applications for it, but at the same time what we're actually doing is we're actually stimulating root development and at the same time improving the soil quality. I always like to talk about bioconversion, and that's just looking at our soil, vegetation, organic materials, livestock continuum. Now I like to bring livestock always into the equation, because I always believe the animal factor is so important. We've underestimated the value of livestock within a lot of these systems that we use as when we recreate or rehabilitate landscapes. So we rehabilitate them by using grasses. Grasses is the feed and the food for livestock. Livestock, particularly cattle and sheep, four-stomached animals, ruminants, they are the only animals that have the ability to convert their grass into something, use it for their own production and performance, and whatever remains, bring it back to the soil. That's also the reason why these animals have split roofs, because they have been designed to be able to scarify soil surfaces, to be able to help incorporate seed, to help incorporate moisture by just breaking the crust if there is one that develops, and an ant. So that interrelationship is so important, which we often forget. And if we look at how many hectares of land we've got out there that's been planted with grass, and yes, we mechanically may be cutting it and mowing it and removing it, the animal factors is still being left out, and I think we need to reintroduce that again. So this whole continuum has got a lot of value in the sense of what it does. When we look at rehabilitated land, there's a lot of variability in the lands. There's a lot of soil out there, different types of soil that have been placed. The fertility, you've got fertility hotspots, the soil's not all over the same. And we need to understand and quantify this correctly so that we know why vegetation doesn't grow or why animals are not performing well on a specific vegetation or not. And the vegetation's quality, which the animal eats, is determined by the soil. And if the soil is not looked after, it just becomes a chain reaction. It's really important to try and get the microbiology, correct in the soil. And this also takes time. And very often we'll see many technologies where we try to introduce inoculants because the soil's dead, and we hear all these stories. But if you go and look at the microbiology within the stomach of a cow or a sheep or any ruminant, you'll be surprised, and I'll get to that now. But it's so important that this microbiology plays a role in nutrient conversion, nutrient bioavailability for vegetation. If you look at what vegetation can do for you in terms of fixating nitrogen out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil, there's vegetation species that can do that. In the past, 50 years ago, I remember the vegetation mixtures used in rehabilitation included a legume. You go and look at species mixtures used now in rehabilitation, the legume has disappeared. The reason it was introduced was because it's a sustainability factor. Bring in a plant that makes its own nitrogen. I don't have to fertilize it, and it brings it back into the system. But at the same time, being a nitrogen-fixing plant is very high in protein and is of huge value to the livestock utilizing it. So it's really important. And if you look at how much nitrogen those plants fixate, if you get them introduced into the system properly, equate it to how much nitrogen you would have had to buy, which they make for nothing just by planting them, that becomes a huge economical factor. If we look at just what can be done to soils, we have to rebuild these soils. Because very often in the rehabilitation practices, you get a lot of mixing up of soils. There's a lot of depletion of nutrients. There's a lot of dilution of nutrients and things that are supporting vegetation. So it's really important that we obviously find ways of trying to ameliorate these soils by using the vegetation. Right, so vegetation conditions, I quickly touched on that. The nutrient quality of vegetation. Nutrient quality of vegetation is extremely important. Not only the value it gives to animals, but there are also anti-quality factors. Now, if we create artificial droughts on our rehabilitated land, and these plants suffer because they're not getting enough moisture and they wilt, plants are very dangerous organisms. They will defend themselves against the herbivore that's going to eat them. And what some plants can do is they will produce a toxic compound, which will then, in some cases, I'll give you an example of some plants, when they go into water stress, they produce cyanoglycoside, which is a precursor to cyanide. And once they consume a lot of plant material, the cyanoglycosides in the bloodstream gets converted to cyanide and can kill animals within 15 minutes. So if you're creating a rehabilitated environment where this vegetation is obviously not, it was conducive to artificial droughts, like I like to call it. Climatologists don't like that term. But nevertheless, this is something we need to be attentive to. And we have to make sure that we understand whether there is this kind of risk or not. The next thing, as I said, we don't want to see animals looking like this if they're going to utilize the land. So this is something that we need to keep in mind. So if we're going to provide them something to consume, because we want them to do a job to be able to help us regenerate this rehabilitated land, we've got to make sure that whatever they got there to eat has of value. And at the same time, do they require any nutritional supplementation? Just looking at the gut of the livestock, you will see that, and looking at animal manure now, nobody would think if you'd think about animal manure today like you wouldn't have thought this, Morgan. No. But anyway, if you look at the amount of microbes within animal manure, there's no inoculant that can have the same amount of microbes in there. And these microbes are responsible for many different things. If you look at how much nutrients are in the urine from animals, how many nutrients are in the manure, I can carry on endlessly to show you the value of manure at the end of the day. And they are the only animals that can convert that grass that has got no value to many people from a rehabilitation point of view. It's got a lot of value in terms of nutrients. You go and buy those nutrients the animal provides to you, you're going to pay a lot of money. All right, so when we look at mineland regeneration and we think about carbon, we like to talk about carbon farming, and this is a hot topic worldwide now. And if you look at it in the rehabilitation context, if we're not using vegetation for animals, can we use vegetation for something else? And this is what's so important. So there's many different ways that we can grow biomass, stimulate roots. Roots are the primary carbon input factor. Take the biomass, use the biomass in whatever particular way. If you want to put it through an anaerobic digester and then generate methane from that, and that's also a form of carbon capture. And at the end of the day, there's a byproduct from that system. That byproduct has got nutritional value. Obviously, you've got to monitor it. It's not balanced, but it can be used back into the system as a secondary carbon input. The same with if you're going to take it through a pyrolysis system. You're also going to be able to do through pyrolysis create syngas or bio-oil, depending on the vegetation you're using, and then the waste product, or I don't like to call it waste, the byproduct from that system has got value and can be returned back into the system as a secondary carbon input. So when we do look about land use optimization, and we're going to look at land use potential databases, we need to create these. We need to understand what our rehabilitation potential is. It might not be arable class. And I can't wait to get to the point that we can have these discussions with the Department of Agriculture and say, maybe invasive plants are not necessarily a bad thing on a rehabilitated landscape. Because you go look at on a rehabilitated landscape, alien invasive plants grow very easily, okay? But they're not managed. And there might be some potential value there, which we'll talk about. But we have to obviously understand what the potential is. Now, the biomass to energy aspect is really, really growing by the day, and I think there's a lot of value in it. Because if we can't use this rehabilitated land for food production yet, because I would like to still say that We've disturbed an environment over a million years of development, and now we expect to have success in 15 years or 20 years of rehabilitation. It's not going to happen. We have to have a phase, a catalytic phase, which is going to be an active phase of regeneration, and then eventually, if the system starts to stabilize, we might be able to bring back crops of huge value. Because remember, if you're competing against the next door neighbor that does not have a mined or rehabilitated land, and the way he produces crops is going to be far more advanced than what you're going to try and do on rehabilitated land. The cost and inputs you're going to try and achieve to get those yields will not be comparable to his. But that's a different discussion. So biomass, what can we grow? What can we use that can either be used in an anaerobic digester maybe, or can be used in a pyrolysis? And if it all can't be used there, it might even be reintroduced as a compost, which is usually required in the rehabilitated landscape. Right, so bioenergy, feedstock, and value of forage and pasture grass, there's a lot of research being done on that. We know which ones can offer you a lot of potential. Whether they will grow in your rehabilitated environment, that still needs to obviously be tested, because we don't know. We've created an environment with a specific soil which we haven't documented and not know very well, and we're obviously now going to know whether these species that do have potential will grow. If we look at other aspects, other organic materials that contribute to soil organic carbon, and eventually the carbon we would like to capture, there's the animal manure we've spoken about. There's compost that can come from vegetation waste, that we can use waste because it's a green waste. Or you might find that these digestates from anaerobics, like I've already mentioned, or even the slurries, these slurries from intensive agricultural systems, the farmers are using it now. They realize the nutritional value. It's not balanced, it might need to be supplemented with inorganic fertilizers, but at the end of the day, it's nutrients that we're keeping back in the system. And it becomes like a little circular economy when it comes to nutrient cycling. And there's many ways that we need to start considering of using these kind of things in the system. Industrial byproducts. I don't want to go into too much of this, but work's been done on this in looking at fly ash, for instance. It's got a lot of agricultural potential, right? But because it was a hazardous waste in the past, it's no longer. It obviously just has to go through strict protocols before you can use it. It plays a huge role in soil amelioration. And a lot of research has been done, over 20 years of this kind of research has been done. And it was that research that actually got fly ash excluded from the Hazardous Waste Classification Act. But it still obviously has to be controlled and managed. So we need to think about these things. They all have nutrient value, and they all have physical value, chemical value, and will support maybe even some kind of microbiological value in the soil. Now, when you look at land use optimization, you try and look at all the different types of soils that you will find in the mine. Some areas, the mine rehab is fantastic, and you've got nice deep soils, and yes, you can probably think about going back to crop production. However, the soil structure is broken down. It's going to be challenging. But with the support of some irrigation, and we know all the work that's being done on irrigating soils with mine water, there's a lot of work being done on that. Gypsiferous mine water specifically has got a huge advantage. It's been proven over and over again. And these are things that we need to start considering about using to support vegetation growth on these rehabilitated landscapes. But you might find places where there's no soil, and we know that this also exists. And we can't imagine what we need to do with this. So this is where we need to start thinking out of the box. Those areas where we do not have a lot of soil or have no soil, we need to think, what can we start using this for? And then the one option that's coming out that's starting to look very promising, yet not a lot done within the rehab space, is agrivoltaics. How can we generate energy in a green way, and still debatable how green, but nevertheless, how can we generate this energy and at the same time incorporate some other land use together? So a dual land use at the same time. And agrivoltaics is looking very promising. But if you're going to bring agriculture into it, there's got to be a matter of soil. If there isn't soil, then you might need to consider other options of maybe using animal shelters, the roofs for solar and things like that, or even greenhouses. So what the agrivoltaic system does, it provides a microclimate which will just facilitate the growth of vegetation below it so that it will help regenerate the soil. So again, it's actually three functions. It's generating energy from the sun, it's creating a microclimate to be able to regenerate the soil, and then also providing you with a product or an agricultural product that can be used in some sort of sense. Those areas that we do not have soil on, why are we not considering intensive agricultural production systems? You go and look at a massive feedlot. Not everybody likes a feedlot, but if there are many feedlots out there that are managed really well and ethically. But if you look at a feedlot, they don't require soil, they just need a foundation. You look at these large-scale commercial greenhouse structures, hectares and hectares of it. Why are we not sort of using these on land where we do not have soil? Intensive agricultural units as well. You go and look at what the economic value of that, or the resource generation value of a unit like that is. It will support every community member within that area that does not even feel passionate about agriculture or using the land. Things like that we need to start thinking about. Plantations. Why are we not looking at trees, shrubs? These got a lot of value. And you go and look at some of the plantations grow. They grow on the side slopes of hills where there's no soil. Okay, so these are things that we need to start thinking out of the box. All right, nitrogen and carbon circular economy, carbon farming. You can't just look at carbon, you need to look at nitrogen. If you look at invasive plants in the country, wattles, sickle bush, prosopis, mesquite, these are all nitrogen fixing plants. That's why they're so invasive, because they make their own nutrients and they just grow like mad and they just use up all the water. Okay? Using up all the water on a rehabilitated coal mine might not be a bad thing. See what happens when you take out a wattle plantation. You see AMD decant somewhere. Okay? It's using water. It's converting the wastewater to something usable. All right? These are things we need to start thinking about. Why can't we use this wattle rather? Plant plantations of wattle. Obviously, we have to get permits and we have to get buy-in from the Department of Agriculture. And these are the conversations we need to start obviously pushing forward so that we can get there. And then maybe taking this wood and making biochar. We know there's a lot of value in biochar, but you can't only use biochar within a rehabilitation activity. Biochar plays an important role, but it's not the only thing that you need when it comes to improving soil organic carbon. We spoke quickly about using the water on the mines. There's a lot of value in it if we understand the water, if we understand the soil in which we are irrigating it with, as well as the vegetation. There's some vegetation that is more tolerant of some of these impacted waters, and we need to identify those plants and use them for some more particular use. We've done a lot of research on phytomining, which is a sense of phytoremediation. It's a kind of a nature-based solution where vegetation has characteristics where they have the ability to hyperaccumulate certain elements of potential value, but also of potential concern. And those plants we need to identify. We've done a couple of those trials already where we've screened about 30 different grasses, one of the Coaltech projects, where we irrigated these plants through an aeroponic system because we wanted to contain the AMD, and we just saw how these plants actually extract out of irrigating this AMD water over the roots of these plants were able to hyperaccumulate certain elements. And one particular aspect was rare earth elements, which is something that has got huge value. Whether it's economical enough, this is still part of the journey of trying to understand whether there's value in it or not. There are some plants that even are hyperaccumulators of sodium. Is there potential of using them if we have waters with higher rich sodium contents? But again, yet it's a function of what soil that you are using to be able to do these things. Livestock performance in primary healthcare. Lastly, 80% of the rehabilitated land out there by default now is grazing. Right? There are the odd one or two areas that have the agricultural potential and can be planted to crops, but it's predominantly grazing. And if we don't want to have to rehabilitate rehabilitated land, we must start using this land. And the first and the lowest hanging fruit is by using livestock. Right? But we still have to monitor the quality of the food they eat as well as the performance of the animals in the system. And we do a lot of this kind of work where we obviously analyze the quality of the plants. We do in vitro digestibility, where we actually extract the rumen, the stomach fluids from the animals. Obviously, this is in a research capacity. Extracted to be able to see how these plants digest and how valuable they will be to the animals and so forth. And we also try and identify anti-quality factors beforehand. Something that I just want to quickly touch on as well is Smart Farm. It's a project that we're doing and we're trying to understand whether there's value in having a smaller piece of land. You know, we have a lot of people that are interested in having land, But I always say, if you can't manage 1 hectare, how are you going to manage 100 hectares? So the idea is to try and come up with a model that will be a community and land regeneration model that will help support people to use the land and obviously regenerate it, and at the same time build carbon. And then obviously when they've achieved what they've achieved, they can move on to another section of land and obviously try and create a closed system of value. Sort of like a subsistence farming model on steroids. Like really trying to take people from the subsistence mindset to something of value and being able to use smaller tracts of land to do that. And then lastly, or nearly lastly, the biomass feedstock and fodder flow program of any mine needs to be determined. And this comes hand in hand with what needs to be done when we are understanding the quality of rehabilitated land. That baseline database is extremely important. And then we can start figuring out what needs to be planted. We don't want every part of the rehabilitated land to be the same thing. And that's why I say this is not an easy farming system. It's a very diverse farming system, farming in brackets, that we are now trying to implement here to try and get the value of all the different parts and tracts of land that has been rehabilitated. So my take-home message today is that rehabilitated land is a resource, not a liability. Okay? And if we change that mindset, yes, there are areas that are going to be a liability, which we with time will try and improve and fix, but it's a resource. Okay? Rehabilitated land requires land management. Don't think that once you've seeded it and you have a maintenance program for 2-3 years that that's going to make the difference. You really got to manage it. You really got to get a feeling of it and understand its potential. If agriculture is a land use option, it's going to be specialized agriculture. That I can tell you. It's not. We get a lot of all our guidelines of how to manage land from agriculture. They were developed in really good agricultural conditions. Now we try and implement them and apply them in a rehabilitated landscape. It's not all the same. And you are going to fail because we have to adapt them so that they are more specific to that environment. Rehabilitated land needs to have a good baseline database. I'm going to mention that again. We do an EIA before we mine. We do an assessment and know exactly what there is. We reinstate the land capability class. We need to understand again what we're dealing with. Not just think that we've created this landscape by looking at the soil depth as a criteria, the only criteria. There's many other criteria that determines the capability of that class. I've seen soils that are placed at a certain depth for a certain land capability class, the bulking factor never taken into consideration, and as the soil settled, it went to a much lower depth, and then it fell into another land capability class. Or something's got great depth, but it's got no nutrient fertility, or there's no fertility. It doesn't support what you think you're going to do on that land capability. So data collection needs to be done in a 1 hectare grid assessment. It's expensive, but that's what precision farmers do. And when you start applying fertilizers, look at precision farmers. They don't apply the same fertilizers all over the same place. That GPS point in their land will tell them, now you apply more fertilizer here than there. And this is how precision farming practices need to be applied to mining, because there's a lot of variability in that. Whether it's feasible and economical, that we still need to obviously determine. Rehabilitated land that's not suitable for traditional agricultural crop production, like annual soil cultivation every year, it might be more suitable for intensive agriculture. And that's something that's less reliant on soil. All right? Go speak to these big chicken farmers that have got 8 houses of chickens and go look at what they generate revenue-wise. There's a huge demand for food. Okay? Why are we not bringing this into rehabilitated landscapes? If we can make it obviously operational and functional, if all the safety acts are not preventing us from doing that, but this is things that we need to start thinking about. Lastly, soil is a bank. It is a bank. And you look at the farmers. Farmers build the nutrients in their soils over the many years, okay, so that it becomes less important to do that. So they just need to tweak. We take the soils when we need to mine, and if we don't preserve those soils, we're going to start from the front, from the beginning again, where farmers started 100 years ago building fertility in soils. Fertility doesn't build quickly. And it's costly if you want to do it the traditional and conventional way. And that's why we now have to consider alternative nutrient sources. organic materials, and so forth. So I do believe that mining companies are going to become land management companies, there's no doubt. And because they're the only people who can understand their land as well as they do. And because I've spoken to many farmers that come and use rehabilitated land, and they're always moaning and swearing about how much more it costs them sometimes. Not always, there's some fantastic rehab land out there, don't get me wrong. But where they don't get the best, then they are going to complain. Farmers always complain, that I can tell you as well. But nevertheless, so it's something that we need to consider in the future, that we might and have to become land managers. Thank you. I think I'm done, and I welcome any questions. Thank you.